TLDR News used to be just one channel, but they have recently divided into many different ones. Now, obviously, since the war in Ukraine is a hot topic right now, they're doing a lot on that. For all their good reports on previous topics, as well as good animations, their recent videos have gotten a lot of stuff wrong. They seem to be big supporters of world order and a group of civilizations that always communicate with each other efficiently. For example, their first video on Russia's new invasion of Ukraine already had the wrong idea. But to be fair, that video was uploaded in the early hours, so they should have waited a bit to get more information. Now, recently they released a video where they claim that China doesn't support Russia in its little endeavors. Not everything they say is wrong here, but I do believe that those parts they get wrong deserve a little bit of correction. The point of this video is to definitely show how China does indeed support Russia in their war in Ukraine.
As the war in Ukraine has escalated, there's been a lot of speculation about how China will respond. Despite a friendly relationship between Putin and Xi, the CCP won't be particularly keen for a full-on war in Europe, not least because of the risk of World War III.
Oh really? Let's see how you argument this.
So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at what China thinks of the war in Ukraine and how they might respond. So we're going to split this video into three parts. First, we're going to take a look at China's stated position on Ukraine, essentially what the Chinese Foreign Ministry has been saying over the last week. Second, we're going to try and figure out what China is actually thinking about Ukraine. And third, we're going to ask whether China could save Russia's crumbling economy. So let's start with the first bit of the video, China's stated position on Ukraine. This is basically the only thing on the agenda at the moment in the Chinese Foreign Ministry's daily press conferences, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been asked about it so many times over the weekend, he put out a special document expounding China's 5-point position on Ukraine. This document is only a few hundred words, so if you want to, you can just go read it for yourself, but the TLDR of those 5 points reads as follows. Point 1 states that China thinks that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, should be respected. China is big on what political theorists call external sovereignty, and has, for this reason, refused to recognise Russia's annexation of Crimea or the independence of Abkhazia or South Ossetia.
I think we can all understand why.
Point 2 says that, in the face of NATO's eastward expansion, China considers Russia's security demands legitimate, and that all sides should give up what the Chinese Foreign Ministry calls the Cold War mentality. The Cold War mentality is a term that's been part of Chinese political lingo for the last 2 decades, and it essentially refers to the idea that national security is a zero-sum game, motivated by a desire for world hegemony. Instead, China recommends that great powers like Russia and NATO accept one another's differences and coexist happily in a multipolar world.
And this is kind of hypocritical because China itself opposes a reunification of the two Koreas because they want a buffer state between themselves and a US allied South Korea, claiming that they will not allow a US major ally to be on their borders. And China also opposes the US supporting India in their most recent border conflict because, well, India also borders China. They have a position very similar to that of Russia. Basically, no. A better way of saying it, their position is exactly the same as that of Russia.
Point 3 says that both sides should exercise restraint to prevent, quote, large-scale humanitarian crises. Point 4 says that China encourages diplomatic efforts conducive to a peaceful settlement in Ukraine, and notes that the Ukraine issue has evolved into a complex historical context. China says that Ukraine should function as a bridge between the East and the West, not a frontier for big world confrontation. Here, China seems to be agreeing with Russia, implicitly advocating against Ukrainian membership of Western organisations like NATO and the EU. China also supports implementing the philosophy of indivisible security, something Putin appealed to in his speech on Thursday last week. The term indivisible security was codified by the OSCE and says that the security of one state should not come at the expense of another. Putin claims that Ukraine's security in the form of NATO or EU membership violates this principle by threatening Russia's security. It's worth saying that this is a particular interpretation of indivisible security, and the OSCE also expressly prohibit any claims to a sphere of influence. But anyway, you get the point. In parroting Putin's talking points on indivisible security, China implicitly legitimizes it.
I've already made a video on this point, so I don't feel like repeating it.
Point 5 says that the UN Security Council should play a role in resolving the Ukraine issue. So those are the 5 points.
And yet, China officially abstained when the UN Security Council voted on Ukraine.
The last thing we'll say is that although it's not included in the 5 points, in his regular press conferences, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also opposes Western sanctions, arguing that sanctions cause more problems than they solve. If you want to know if that's true, go and watch our video on sanctions. Anyway, that's China's stated position on Ukraine. While it doesn't approve of Russia's violating Ukraine's sovereignty, China is sympathetic to Russia's apparent legitimate security concerns, and seems to implicitly advocate Ukrainian non-membership of NATO and the EU. In his press conferences over the last week, Wang Yi has held this line consistently. So that's what China says it thinks. But what does it really think? Well, obviously it's hard to know, but there are signs that it's not particularly happy. Originally, China was supportive of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In early February, China released a statement supporting Russia's demands against further NATO enlargement and accused the US of hegemonic hypocrisy. This was somewhat unsurprising. China has spent the last few years railing against Western hegemony and saw NATO enlargement as a symptom of that same problem. But while China shared Russia's antipathy to the Western world order, that didn't mean that they wanted full-out war in Ukraine, for 3 reasons. First, it's bad for the economy. The sanctions that the world has imposed on Russian banks, companies and individuals are unprecedented. This is the first time a G20 central bank has been sanctioned, and will have as yet unknown consequences for the global economy. At the moment, China's property sector, which makes up 25% of GDP, is struggling with falling sales and mass defaults. The last thing the CCP needs right now is a war-induced global economic crisis. The war could force China to make a decision between Russia and the West. In his speeches before the war in Ukraine, Putin seemed to imply that he wasn't worried about sanctions because he could just trade with China instead. If Putin's invasion had gone as planned, this would probably have worked. Unfortunately for Putin, it hasn't, and the West has significantly stepped up sanctions. If the West decides to implement secondary sanctions, i.e. sanctions on countries that help Russia, like possibly China, China will have to decide whether it wants to support Russia or keep its place in the world's financial order. It violates the rules-based system that China is supposed to be committed to. China regularly expresses its support for a rule-based order based on the UN and related institutions. China often uses this framing to criticize the US when it violates UN rules, as it did in Iraq in 2003, or with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the US is yet to ratify. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not sanctioned by the UN, which puts China in a tough spot. So you get the point, China is wary of full-on war in Ukraine. This is probably why China abstained on a recent UN resolution condemning Russia, rather than vote against it, and why certain state-owned banks have implemented limited sanctions on Russia. Nonetheless, so far, China has been pretty cautious.
Now, this is the antithesis that I wanted to talk about. China's support of Russia has long been anticipated, even before the invasion itself took place. China has, so far, not even acknowledged Russia's invasion as an actual invasion. In fact, when one of China's foreign ministry spokespersons was asked 11 times if this was an invasion, she refused to answer all 11 times. During the Winter Olympics, for example, both Russia and China even signed 15 cooperation agreements and even proclaimed that their partnership has no limits. On top of that, an intelligence report leaked to the New York Times that it was Xi Jinping who asked Putin to postpone the invasion until after the Olympic Games. And guess what? It actually happened. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, well after the Olympic Games concluded in Beijing. It is also worth noting that on the day of Russia's invasion, China increased its wheat imports from Russia with the goal of easing sanctions. Now, there are more economic points here, but I'll get to those in a moment. Also, one thing to note out is that between the two, a report from the Financial Times states that Moscow has even asked Beijing for weapon support. Now, this has been disputed as both Moscow and Beijing have pretty much denounced this claim, but if it is true, then It would basically mean that China itself is actively engaged in this conflict. One point that TLDR has made in a previous video, but not in this one, is the impact this would have on Taiwan. Back in 2021, the news was dominated by high tensions between China and Taiwan as Beijing constantly flew jets over Taiwanese airspace. On the very day that Russia invaded Ukraine, China flew fighter jets over Taiwan again. The West's restraint in Ukraine could benefit Beijing as it would make them more confident in taking military action in Taiwan. Not only would they be confident in taking on the rest of the world in this matter, they would be even more confident than Russia in taking on its own citizens. Whereas Russian cities are riddled with protests, China has a much firmer grip on information flow in their own country. All of that would prove useful in forwarding their own agenda. What makes TLDR's claims even more strange in this video is that they previously stated this in another video.
While Russia and China don't have a formal military alliance, they've been running regular joint exercises for the last decade or so, and things have really heated up recently. Since 2018, China and Russia have performed 4 joint exercises, the latest coming in August this year, when Russian forces joined the Chinese in Ningxia for the most comprehensive joint military exercise either side has performed in recent history. Unsurprisingly, the fact that China and Russia are becoming ever closer military allies has caused some anxiety in the West, and especially America. If the idea of your 2 most powerful enemies forming a military alliance wasn't stressful enough, the fact that they're both simultaneously getting ready for separate military campaigns is making life in the US even tougher. As we mentioned in our previous video, China seems keener than ever on forcing reunification with Taiwan, which Biden has promised to defend, while Russia is currently engaged in a long-running, low-intensity war with Ukraine, who are also supported by America. It's not 100% clear that the US have the military resources to deal with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, let alone a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and a surge in Russian activities in Ukraine.
Now, regarding the last point, China has exactly been very cooperative with UN rules recently. A few years ago, they rejected a UN resolution that turned down China's claims to the South China Sea. They have also violated another nation's borders back in 2020 when they had a border skirmish with India, the first armed conflict they ever had with another nation since the Johnson-Southwest skirmish in 1988. And this is the 4th time in history that 2 nuclear powers have directly confronted each other.
Although if the war continues to escalate, China will probably be forced to more actively pick a side. This leads us on to the third and final bit of this video. If China did side with Russia, could China save Russia's economy? Well, the first thing to say is that no one knows what the economic fallout will be, so this is all speculative. But the evidence suggests that while China could help, the Russian economy will definitely suffer in the short to medium term. This is largely because all the things that China could do to help will take time. For example, there's been some speculation that China and Russia could develop an Eastern alternative to SWIFT. In practice, this would take years, if not decades, to be implemented. Similarly, there's been some speculation that China could replace Europe as Russia's main oil and gas market. Again, this will take time. Current gas pipelines from Russia to China only have an annual capacity of about 35 BCM, with new pipelines expected to take that number to 50 BCM by 2025. But this is less than 30% what Russia currently sells to Europe. Nonetheless, while China won't be able to save the Russian economy in the short term, it'll still be interesting to see how they react to Putin's war in Ukraine, and whether we could be seeing the beginning of a new anti-Western Russia-China axis.
Like any economic shift, the transition may be difficult. We had to take into consideration the fact that these 2 countries are neighbors, and that trade between them is relatively easy. Not only that, but trade is increasing faster than anyone is anticipating. In the 1990s, trade between the 2 nations was at $8 billion. That number is expected to grow to $200 billion by 2024. Most products from Russia come in the form of mineral fuels, oil, and petroleum products, while China's imports mostly consist of machinery, clothing, chemicals, and furniture. Because of this, China has been Russia's main trading partner since 2010, and Russia has become China's main energy importer. Not only that, but in regards to finances, Russia and China have even agreed to a currency swap agreement in order to make both the ruble and the yuan more stable. That is something that will minimize the effect of sanctions on Russian currency. One thing that TLDR also failed to state is that these two countries are working on a Eurasian Economic Union in order to start a free trade zone, and the countries are already part of many organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Asia Cooperation Dialogue. While it is true that solidifying more reliance on China will take time, it will be done a lot faster than others expect. The prospect of an emerging Russia-China alliance has been feared for over a decade, well before a war with Ukraine even started. Now that it has been solidified even further, it's being put to the test. And based on what we're seeing right now, it's pretty much passing that test. Everything is coming full circle from 2014, only more serious now. China's prospects about Russia's invasion is now a mirror image of what it was back in 2014, when China also abstained at the UN Security Council meeting on Crimea and also signed a $40 billion gas deal with Russia. Everyone is starting to see that even more now. And not only that, their own people are starting to see it. Hell, even most Chinese people support Russia, both in regards to their cooperation and their invasion of Ukraine.
As the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to unfold, one country we're not hearing much from at the moment is China. But isn't China supposed to be one of Russia's biggest allies? So are you curious about ordinary Chinese citizens' reactions to the Russia and Ukraine war? What do the Chinese think about Russia and Putin as a leader in general?
错了，但是我感到呢，这个叫做俄罗斯呢，普京不是他侵占乌克兰，他是为了保持这个国家的安全，为了保护自己的国家。安全人民的生活幸福。
那你会如何去描述中国和俄罗斯的两国的关系呢？就在中国，我们对俄罗斯是什么样的一个看法？然后总体上是偏消极还是偏积极呢？
我觉得大部分人应该都是偏积极的吧，毕竟我们自己也有一些这个主权问题没解决嘛。其实我相信很多跟我一样的人也会相信，如果我们有一位这样的总统，可能会变得有趣一些。
那你对俄罗斯领导人普京有一些什么看法？
这个人克格勃出身嘛，然后年纪现在这么大，然后连续做了这么多年总统，应该是一个当总统经历很丰富，然后应该蛮有经验的吧。
我觉得他蛮有趣的。每次看到他的一些新闻都是就是跟我们的就是维尼熊握手或者什么的，对，习大大对这种，就是感觉他在我们国家还是蛮受好评的。